Abigail, thank you for joining our podcast. Would you like to please introduce yourself a little bit?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me. My name is Abigail Haddad. I'm a data scientist. I'm an ML engineer now. I was a data scientist for 8 years. I've been kind of in and out of government, doing all those things. I'm currently at DHS as an ML engineer, and I'm obligated to say I'm giving this interview in my personal capacity, not in my DHS capacity.
So data scientist before and now AML engineer?
Correct. And I guess that was partly a transition. I was doing this data science interview, and they're having me clean data, and I wasn't that great at it, because it was the kind of thing that at this point I would ask ChatGPT for, and kind of secondly, the whole time I was kind of thinking, this isn't really what you hire me for these days. Like, you hire me if you want to, architect something, if you want some pipelines, if you want it done in kind of a sustainable, scalable way. And so for me, that's part of why I'm calling myself an ML engineer these days, is that I want to be kind of building the bigger, more sustainable things and coding in a way that is a little bit more software developer-y. So I'm making that career transition.
But can you explain to me, like a 5-year-old, the difference between data scientist and AML engineer?
I think we're all kind of figuring that out now. And so just as data science 10, a little bit more years ago, was really kind of just coming into being a thing, and we were figuring out what that meant. I think with ML engineering, it's not super new, but it's certainly something that with the kind of recent expansion in terms of what we can do with AI tooling, it's definitely gotten bigger.
Gotcha.
And so I would say there are ML engineers who are coming from software development and who have really, really strong skills in that area and less data. And then there's folks like me who are coming from data science. But I would say it's about transitioning from I'm doing a thing with a data set, or even I'm doing a thing in a pretty sustainable way where I'm building something, and towards more building pipelines that are robust, that are scalable. I write objects analysis as classes, and really doing things in a way that's bigger and more repeatable and more like software.
Gotcha.
And so I would say I'm definitely more on like the data science end of it than the software engineering end of it, but my technical practices are growing and have been growing.
All right. So, can you tell us a little bit about your experience, your career, right? You have been going back and forth between federal sector and private sector. I think that's awesome. I see that you were in the Army National Guard, then Deloitte, then a government contractor, then Army, then CTG. I think it's more of a consulting company, right? And then, Homeland Security. So if you don't mind, can you tell us a little bit about what you did in each of these places?
Totally. So my first data science job was at Deloitte, but I'd really been working for the government in some capacity doing data analytics for much longer than that. So I started off in the public policy program at RAND, and part of what that program is, a big part of the appeal for me, was that you work on actual RAND projects. So I did a significant amount of work, mostly for the Army and the Air Force, in personnel analytics. And that wasn't really data science, it wasn't really Python or R, but it was data, it was statistical analysis. And being at an FFRDC, at a federally funded research and development center, was really interesting, and getting to really be working for real government clients and, in the room for meetings, that kind of thing was enormously valuable for my later career. From there, I was at the Guard as kind of a statistician contractor position when I transitioned to data science, which is really just about learning a bunch of Python and kind of saying hi, I've been doing statistical analysis for you guys for a while, but now I have this added skill set. So my first data science job was at Deloitte. I was still very much learning how to be a data scientist there, because I would say in those days it was much easier to get your first data science job and much harder to actually learn how to be a data scientist.
Interesting. So in those days, and this was only 5 years ago.
It was 8 years ago. It was eternity.
Okay, 8. Okay.
So I was on a project with the Navy. I was on a project for IRS. And from there, I left for a contractor job at the Pentagon. And then very quickly, my client hired me for a civil service position in the Army. And, I would say in all of these, I was doing pretty general data science work. Sometimes it was personnel analytics, it was text data, but it was kind of like whatever data somebody had on hand and needed done, I was doing. And I would say, my goal with all of these, and really with all the career moves I've made, until maybe the current one, but were really about technical growth and about where I could keep moving up, but also keep really learning and staying technical, because that was really important to me. And I think that's something that, especially in government, that if that's something you want, then you're going to find yourself needing to very actively manage your career and sort of figure out how to not wind up managing people or managing projects or somehow not hands-on keyboard. And I just very much, in all of those, wanted to remain hands-on keyboard.
That is interesting, because a lot of people, when they think about their career development, at the end of the day, managing people is how you grow, how you have more responsibilities. You are a little bit saying the opposite. I didn't want to manage people. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I really didn't. A few times, actually, at Army, someone sent me an org chart where I was managing people, and I was like, please don't do this to me. I'm not ready for this.
Right.
Which is funny. I mean, you're not supposed to say that, but I didn't feel ready career-wise, and I also just really wanted to be coding. And I think it's really hard once you're in a position where you're managing people or you're managing contractors. You just don't really have the time to be coding, which means it's much harder to keep growing technically. And then the next job you want, you're not going to have the experience that you need to be in that position.
Gotcha. But would you say that that's a limitation from a career standpoint? How are you going to grow in your career if you love what you do, but you love it in a way that does not involve managing people? And, as you grow in any hierarchy, if you want to grow, you have to manage people. So is there any path, I guess, to have growing responsibilities and not manage people?
Well, there definitely is to a certain point. I definitely have so far. And I think I definitely think about the next step. And so, for instance, in the federal government, there are these senior leader positions, which are post-GS15. And so the goal is that you can continue to grow as a subject matter expert without being an SES, without managing people. Oh, HQE is also in DoD. And so I just pulled some of the OPM. One of the advantages of being a data person is you can go find the data on the questions you have in your life.
Very fast, right?
It's great. No, I love it. So there's an OPM data set that answers the question of what agencies have these folks, and I pulled it and I will analyze it at some point. But, I'm not in a hurry to go anywhere. I just got a new job. I'm happy. But definitely it is one of the questions I think about, is to what extent is this career limiting, and also to what extent am I just happy where I am?
Exactly. Absolutely.
I don't know yet.
No, absolutely. I agree with that. It's not everything about career development. You love what you do, you're happy, that's it. I agree with that. So let me ask you this. I have seen some of your the content that you produce on GitHub. So what is it about it? I read that you mentioned that there's no federal GitHub, and you believe that that is true with everything. I remember 10 years ago, I was somewhere in Huntsville, in the restaurant Arsenal, and we were trying to have somebody in Fort Rucker, Georgia, use certain software. It was so hard. I don't think the government shares, maybe I'm wrong in my limited knowledge, the government does not share it. I think the same different agencies are producing the same type of software. And I think you're approaching this thing from an AI/ML perspective, but I think it's all the same. The government is not good at sharing things. Am I wrong, you think, or what's going on there?
Yeah, so I would say, federal GitHub is really just GitHub, and so every agency, every department does have some GitHub presence, but it definitely varies in terms of how active they are. And I know this is something I'm just recently getting into, so I don't want to speak too much, but I know, there have been ongoing efforts to get the government to share more code, and, they have shared more code to some extent. I can speak more to my experience as a data scientist, which is, for sure, nobody has ever said to me, put your code on GitHub. Sometimes when I've asked, I've been told, absolutely go ahead. Other times I've been told, don't do that. But in terms of how this sort of attempt to share more code has filtered down, I would say at least it is not really filtered down to me specifically. And I think that's something there are currently more efforts around. I think it's hard. I think we sort of get into the habit of thinking things can't be public without necessarily doing kind of individual risk analysis on, okay, but can this specific thing be public? It's definitely hard to just not make things public, but certainly a lot of the things I've done over the years could be. Some of them are with public data. Others are not with public data, so you wouldn't want to share the data, but you could share the code. I also run into this on the civilian side with contractors, where you're really trying to figure out something somebody did because they gave you a number and you really want to see how they got to that number, and where even on the client side it can be difficult to get that, in part because we don't always say to contractors, hey, you need to develop your code in a way that makes everything accessible. So like things get done in Excel spreadsheets, which make it very difficult to tell what somebody did. And so it's an issue for our own understanding, and obviously it's also an issue when you have an incumbent and you want somebody else to take over that contract. It's an issue when it's not as easy as just saying, hey, here's a code repo, when a lot of the knowledge is buried in other places that make it harder to transition that.
Let me just ask you an obvious thing. What would be the advantage of government agencies sharing code? I guess it will save time, but wouldn't it be an administrative nightmare to do it, you think? Do you think...
I mean, some code absolutely should not get shared. And so when I bring this up, people are always like, okay, but, there's drone stuff that we're doing, or there's this really top secret thing. And I am definitely not an absolutist on all code written for the government should get shared. Like, absolutely not.
Okay.
There's some things that really do present issues. But for other things that are a lot more generic, so like everybody wants a certain kind of AI tool right now, a certain kind of chatbot. And we're figuring things out in various places about how to build those in a way that is good. And so, for instance, like I've heard about things happening in the government that I think are really excellent in terms of how they're handling that. And I want there to be an easier way for us to share that with other people.
So what is the impact of AI/ML in the world and in the government? What do you think is going to change? 10 years from now, what is going to be different? Or what is the impact right now? What's going to be different in 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say that from a personal standpoint, and I'm sure this extrapolates out, like, I use LLMs in my coding in a huge way. It rarely is the case that on the first try it gets it right when I ask it for something, and I'm still giving it a lot of guidance. But it speeds up my development in general. It speeds up my development of sort of best practices of doing things in kind of a better way. And that's been huge. And I think that it could stay where it is now, and just the adoption and the figuring out how to integrate it into kind of our workflows. I think that for people who code, maybe even data scientists more than developers, I'm not sure, but for people who code, I think this is an enormous assistant at this point. Again, and it could stay where it is now, and I think there's still productivity increases just from where it is now. And I would say the same thing with certain types of synthesizing information, copy editing. I use it. It's not a very good writer, but it finds my typos, and that's not world-changing, but it's good, right?
Oh, yeah.
And so I think there's a lot of sort of small to medium productivity things where it could not get any better, and it would still, just from people adopting it, it still gets more useful. There's bigger things, so like making information more accessible, so like this chatbot stuff, where I think I've said a lot of negative things about it, but I think we're really getting better on how to make that work. And then, look, there's much bigger kinds of things people want to use this for, where I either don't know that much about it, or I think it's contingent on it getting better. That's why I don't want to make predictions. But I'd say, like, my prediction is even if it doesn't get better, that adoption really will make certain intellectual tasks, coding and writing, a bit easier, a bit faster.
And what would you think about the AI/ML replacing a lot of jobs and all of that?
Yeah, so if your job is labeling data, and that is some people's job, is labeling data, then I think that is something where these tools are very good now, and will get better just because as we train them more specifically for things. Things like very low-level coding and very low-level writing.
Right.
And it's kind of already there on being able to do those things. For other things, I think it could kind of go either way. So like, for instance, it makes it easier to code, but that means we're also producing much more code. And if you're producing much more code, you probably want somebody to look at that code.
Right, so in a way, yeah, right.
Yeah, it could go either way, right?
Gotcha. What advice do you have for AI/ML engineers or data scientists to develop their career?
Yeah, so I think for government specifically, and we sort of talked about this a little bit, if you want to stay technical, really expect to be actively managing your career and thinking about what the next thing you might want to do is and how you can learn the things you need for that, because you might not be getting them at your current job. And I think that's especially true for a lot of civil servant positions, where as you get more senior, it's easy to find yourself in a role where you're managing contractors, you're briefing out the slides that the guys from Booz made, and that's not the skill that you're going to need if you want to be in a data scientist or developer position, either within the government or outside of it. And so they're really taking kind of control of that, both in terms of what personal projects you do, what skills you develop, and ultimately what jobs you take. Because there is so much cool stuff happening that is very technical in the federal government, both civil service and the contractor side of our DCs. And it's just about figuring out what you want to be doing and kind of setting yourself up for that.
It's hard, right? Because I think most people, including me, once you have a job, you kind of stay there, and you have to be very proactive in order to look for a job and go somewhere else. You haven't thought about that silly psychological thing, at least for me and some people I know, how to be proactive in managing your career.
Well, look, I think ideally this is something that wouldn't be so difficult, and I think that as hopefully more civil service positions are more technical, that you won't have to do this quite as much. But at the moment, I think looking at job listings, like even when you're not actively job searching, and just thinking about what you might want to be doing, and then those skills you need, trying to figure out, like ideally those are skills you can get at your current job. And sometimes you really can. Like sometimes you can say to your manager, like, hey, I found a place, like we have this data set, we have this thing, and I think it would really contribute if I could build this thing. And a lot of times people say yes. Like frequently it's not the case that anybody's actively trying to keep you from being technical. They just don't know what to ask you to build. And so ideally, if you can build something at your current job, that's good both because you're doing it at work, but also because you'll get more information about how to do it in a way that's useful, because there'll be other stakeholders who can weigh in on things and say, oh, actually, we need it this way. And that's really valuable input you can't get for purely personal projects that you do by yourself. So yeah, I would say that's the first two pieces, are figuring, like, reading job listings, seeing what you need, seeing what people are talking about online that's cool. And your first step is figuring out if you can do it as part of your current job.
Let me ask you this, from a career standpoint, at what point it looks bad to be changing so much? And what is the minimal amount of time that you think does not look bad to work for someone, right? Because it's not great when if you work 3 months in one place and so what do you think about that?
So I would say I think it really depends on where you are. So like my shortest tenure was maybe 6 months, and it was because my client hired me into a civil service position. And no one has ever asked me in an interview why I left, because they saw that next job and they could tell why I left.
Okay.
Whereas I was at Army for over 2 years, and I frequently still get asked, why did you leave? Because it's confusing to leave a GS-15 civil service position. Even if you waited a couple of years, that's still a move that needs explaining. And so I would say, like, there isn't some length of time that needs explaining. It's also about the context of where you were and whether there's an easy narrative for why somebody would leave. And so in contractor worlds, people leave all the time. Like there's no job security, but there's also really not a lot of expectation that you'll stay, because in a lot of places there's not necessarily much career development. You're hired for a particular project, that kind of thing. There's high turnover, whereas in civil service there's not. And so it is something that I think requires more thought and more explanation. What
is the difference in your experience between working federal government, working contractor side or the commercial side? Have you seen what a lot of people say, that commercial side is more advanced?
So, yes and no. I think that, so I haven't worked at some place like Google or even Palantir. I think that it's true that the most cutting edge work that's being done, if you want to train the biggest LLM, if you want to train the biggest foundation model, then you're not going to be doing that as a federal government employee. But beyond that, I would say, like, certainly in data science, there's a significant amount of overlap between the work happening by civil servants and the kinds of contractors that are doing certainly like staff augmentation work or even some of the building. I would say, though, it's easier if you're a software developer or a data scientist, and it's certainly faster. So it's easier and faster to get a job that is very technical as a contractor than it is to apply for the federal government and figure out, is this the job that's actually technical, and then once you get hired, just stay technical. But in terms of the actual work, there's a lot of overlap.
Do you have any thoughts or any advice for, data scientists, AIMS, on developing a network in order to, advance your career, find new opportunities? Do you have any thoughts on that? It's certainly very important, at least in the federal, well, I guess both in the commercial sector and the federal. Do you have any experiences on that side?
Yeah, I would say the most useful networking I've done is very specific networking. So I think it's kind of intimidating to a lot of technical people to think in terms of like, you're supposed to go into this room or to this conference and you're supposed to chat with somebody and you're supposed to make them want to hire you. And I would encourage you to not think of it that way and instead think of like networking for engineers is being able to talk about what you're building and how you're excited about it and what problems you're thinking about with other people who are thinking about those things too. And so I get into very detailed, very nerdy conversations with other data scientists and other engineers, and sometimes people in more managerial positions too who are still technical. And that's the really useful stuff for me, is being able to talk about my work and my interests. And so it's not about like, there's not necessarily a ton of small talk. I'm not great at that part. But just what you're trying to show is like, here's what I'm interested in, here's what I'm working on. And somebody might say like, oh, hey, we're trying to do that too here. Or how do you approach this? Or, oh, I solved that problem already. And it's those conversations which can be really genuine and I think really useful career-wise.
Great experience. Abigail, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much.